My dear brothers and sisters, in the next few days of the octave of Easter, you will be hearing from the gospel stories about the so-called apparitions of the resurrected Jesus. You know, these stories, they are not so much about the resurrection of Jesus as about the resurrection of the disciples. How their encounters with the risen Christ will bring them back together and will give new life to their relationship, not just with Jesus, but with each other. And suddenly, all that they had experienced in Jerusalem would begin to have new meaning. So one of these stories is what we read tonight. It's the story of the two disciples who were on their way to a village called Emmaus. Take note, please. They're not just walking under a bright moonlight. They are running away. They are escaping from the upper room in Jerusalem. You know, this story reminds me of that grandmother character in the movie Tanging Yaman. I'm sure if you are Filipinos, you probably have watched that movie by Loris Guillen, Tanging Yaman. The grandmother there is Gloria Romero. Perhaps because the grandmother had gone through so much pain, seeing her children quarreling, fighting with each other, and in constant rivalry, she ended up developing Alzheimer's disease. In the movie, the younger son, who happened to be more accomplished, much wealthier, insisted that it was about time that he brought home his mother to his better equipped house, just to keep her away from his older brother, who was the prodigal type, but whom his mother loved very much, whom his mother was very fond of. One day, she had a moment of lucidity when her prodigal brother's daughter visited the old woman and sang a song for her, a religious song entitled Ikaw Lamang. I think it was composed by Manuling Francisco. In the middle of her song, a flash of memory was refreshed in her grandmother, enabling her to recognize the granddaughter for a brief moment. It was a brief moment, but a rather tearful and a rather joyful moment. A moment of recognition. Back now to the gospel. The two disciples in the gospel have just been through a very painful experience in Jerusalem after the arrest and violent crucifixion of Jesus by the Romans. St. Luke tells us that he had been walking and talking with them for quite a while, but they failed to recognize him. Para ba silang nag-Alzheimer? The moment of recognition would come later. While they were at table, after Jesus took the bread and broke it, there was a moment of recognition. And I'm sure you would like to know why. What was it about that gesture of the breaking of the bread that enabled these two disciples to recognize Jesus? Well, we need a little background for that. You see, in the time of Jesus, There were a lot of formalities during their table fellowships. It was impolite to just sit at table and eat without observing the proper rituals. Not only were the guests supposed to wait for everybody until everyone has already done the proper ritual of hand washing, and after the food has already been blessed, they also had to wait for the host to give them the sign that it was now okay to start eating. It was the host who was supposed to give this signal. And what is the signal? It was a gesture. The gesture of taking the first loaf of bread and breaking it. That means, kain na tayo. After that, they could eat already. Now, in this Emmaus story, the two disciples were the ones who actually invited Jesus. Remember, they said to him, "Stay with us, please." So they invited Jesus to stay with them and to have dinner with them. Hindi ba? If you're the one inviting, it means you are offering a treat. Ikaw ang magbabayad. So they were supposed to be the hosts because they invited him. But what happened when they sat down? It was Jesus who played the host. It was Jesus who took the bread and said the blessing and broke the bread and gave it to them. Usually the host would break the bread and eat it, and that means kain na. But Jesus broke the bread and gave it to them. Meaning he played not just the role of the host, he played the role of the servants, like he did at the Last Supper, including washing their feet. And it was that very gesture, at that moment, it was the gesture that gave them the moment of lucidity, that allowed them to recognize Jesus in the stranger. Sabi siguro nila sa sarili nila, maybe they said to themselves, "We know this guy. We know of only one person who would do this." And then, St. Luke tells us, he disappeared. I wonder if you know that there is an institution inside the campus of Ateneo de Manila that is offering courses in pastoral counseling and psychology called Emmaus. Yes, the name of the village in this gospel. And now this gospel for Easter Sunday evening would probably give you an idea why they named their center Emmaus. I think they saw in the characters of the two travelers the typical kind of people who need their services. It used to be called a counseling center, but now it seems they prefer to call it pastoral accompaniment. Yes, pastoral accompaniment. The two travelers in our Emmaus story are in a state of trauma after what they had been through, after what they had witnessed in Jerusalem. Along with the rest of the apostles, they are in stages of grieving, and they are seriously in need of accompaniment because they are suffering from what we would call today PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD, the thing that is typical of people who are going through the stages of grieving. On the other hand, there is the stranger character who turns out to be the risen Christ. And he does exactly what a therapist usually would do to people who are grieving. No, counselors don't go immediately into giving advice anymore. In fact, we don't call it counseling if it's about advice giving. What does he do first? Take note. The first thing he did was, he drew near. Lumapit muna siya. Secondly, he entered into their conversation. Thirdly, he listened to them. He allowed them to talk. Ang tawag dito ngayon is debriefing. He gave them the opportunity to debrief. And fourthly, he stays with them and breaks bread with them. Finally, he disappears. You see, importante din pala in the ministry of the pastoral accompanier to disappear. You have to know the moment when you can allow the person to just carry on with his life. You know, counselors would agree that these are mostly the most healthy ways of dealing with traumatized persons. Persons who are going through the stages of grieving. And these stages have been identified by a psychologist named Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And they are shock, denial, anger, depression, acceptance. We don't have time to talk about them. But did you know that lately there is another psychologist who added what he called a sixth stage of grieving? They're not just 5. In fact, I don't even want to call them stages. I think they are aspects of grieving because they don't go in that order always. No. A sixth stage or aspect. And you know what the sixth aspect is? Finding meaning. Pagtuklas ng kahulugan. Finding meaning. And this is what the reason Jesus facilitates in these 2 disciples. And wonder of wonders, as they walk along, they forget about their fears and their disillusionments. And the end of the story is even more amusing. They return to Jerusalem. They had just been escaping, running away from, but suddenly, they returned to Jerusalem. It's like they totally forgot that they were afraid of Jerusalem. You see why I say this story is really not just about the resurrection of Jesus, but about the disciples being resurrected from the dead. And what do I mean by that? The company of apostles. They could have disbanded. They could have fallen out. They could have ended up blaming each other. They could have gone their separate ways. But what happened? They found themselves coming back to each other with stories of encounter and moments of recognition that led to his disappearance. You see, that is what you call accompaniment. And it is what the resurrected Jesus does to his disciples. Accompaniment. And in this time of the pandemic crisis, it is what a lot of people need most. Brothers and sisters, there are many people out there who are scared. There are people out there who have lost a loved one and not been able to even visit them. There are people in hospitals who die alone, who are not even grieved. This is too terrible for a lot of people. And there are a lot of people in this lockdown who do not know where to get their next meal. Accompaniment. People are looking for that stranger with a good heart, who draws near, who enters into their lives, who listens to them, who breaks bread with them, and disappears when he has to. Like I said last night, we are not just called to be Christians. We are called to be Christ. You are a part of the body of Christ. And so we all must participate in the mission of Christ. We must not just wait for others to accompany us. We must go out of our way to accompany those in need of accompaniment. Let us stop waiting for Christ to come. Let us rather play the role of that kind-hearted stranger who had all the patience to draw near, to walk with, to listen, and to stay and break bread with these men who felt so lost, so that after the encounter, they would find their way back to where they really should be going.